Hello, I'm Aaron Miller, the Medical Director of the Corinne Goldsmith Dickinson Center for Multiple Sclerosis at the Icahn School of Medicine in New York, New York. We are now going to discuss current and emerging therapies in MS. What does the evidence say? Our learning objective for this portion is to assess the latest evidence on the efficacy and safety of current and emerging therapies for relapsing and progressive MS. Let's start by talking about some of the long-term clinical and MRI outcomes in relapsing remitting MS with alemtuzumab, results from the CARE-MS1 and CARE-MS2 trials. Both of those randomized controlled trials in which alemtuzumab was compared to interferon beta 1A 3 times a week were highly successful. And this extension study shows that there has been prolonged clinical benefit with alemtuzumab in patients with relapsing remitting MS, irrespective of age. So the improved clinical outcomes as well as the MRI outcomes that were seen at 2 years were maintained through year 8. There was a significantly lower annualized relapse rate. 59 to 80% had stable or improved EDSS scores. 50 to 77% were free of 6-month confirmed disease worsening, and interestingly, 39 to 49% achieved confirmed disability improvement. 61 to 86% were free of MRI disease activity. And there was no more than a median 1.64% reduction in brain volume loss. The safety profile remained good, with no difference from that was seen in the pivotal randomized controlled trial. Again, it's important to emphasize that a substantial percentage of patients achieved 6-month confirmed disability improvement over 6 years, regardless of their baseline EDSS score. Similar excellent results were found on long-term clinical and MRI outcomes in patients with relapsing remitting MS in the TOPAZ study. Looking at the prolonged results from CARE-MS2, either patients who were initiated on alemtuzumab or patients who were switched from subcutaneous interferon beta 1A to alemtuzumab showed a marked percentage of patients who were free of relapses annually. Essentially 70% of patients in either group had stable or improved EDSS scores. I won't go through reading all of the data, but one can see that there's a substantially positive results in this prolonged extension study with this potent disease-modifying therapy. It is noteworthy, however, that over the course of 6 or 8 years, depending on which study group we're looking at, there were a significant number of patients who were not totally free of disease. In fact, NIDA, the concept that means no evidence of disease activity, was sustained in only 15% of the alemtuzumab-initiated patients, and in 27% of those patients who switched from subcutaneous interferon beta 1A. And the newest disease-modifying agent on the market now in the United States is cladribine. Cladribine is an oral medication that was initially studied more than a decade ago. The drug was initially rejected by the FDA as well as by the European regulatory authorities because of a cancer concern. After subsequent data was presented to both of these regulatory agencies, the drug has been approved first in Europe about a year and a half ago, and in the United States in March of 2019. Cladribine is improved in the United States for patients who have failed other therapies, and continues to carry a warning signal or a warning box about the potential for malignancy. In fact, there was only a small increase in the malignancy rate, and all of the malignancies were different. So it's unclear that there really is truly a signal. Nonetheless, this does appear in the prescribing information. Cladribine is given in a rather unique way. It's a weight-based dosing regimen. So a number of tablets are given over a few days at the start of therapy, and again over a few days 3 to 4 weeks later. And then that cycle is repeated one year later. And what we're seeing in this presentation, again, is that there is efficacy for the drug in patients irrespective of age. This result was true both clinically and for new gadolinium enhancing lesions compared to placebo. More patients achieved NIDA status in the Clarity trial. And in the Clarity extension study, NIDA status was achieved in 40.9% and 28.2% of patients in the over 45 and under 45 subgroups, respectively. A Clarity extension trial was carried out, which was a little bit complicated to interpret because there was a gap in therapy before the extension trial, and some patients actually, I believe, received other therapies. Nonetheless, the extension data continued to demonstrate a benefit from Clarity, just those 2 courses of administration. In patients with high disease activity, in fact, this clinical efficacy of cladribine was sustained through year 4. One of the important considerations in trying to decide whether or not to treat a patient with a particular drug is whether a drug is more efficacious than another. We have a lot of data from individual trials of particular agents versus placebo, but we know that it's not strictly legitimate to compare these results across trials. The only way that we absolutely know for sure that one drug is more effective than another is to use both the agents in a head-to-head trial. Unfortunately, this has been done only relatively infrequently. At the CMSC meeting, there was, however, a report of a head-to-head comparison between fingolimod and glatiramer acetate in people with relapsing remitting MS. This trial was known as the ASSESS trial. The trial revealed that fingolimod in its standard dose of 0.5 milligrams was superior to glatiramer acetate in reducing both clinical and MRI disease activity. The annualized relapse rate in patients on fingolimod was 0.153 versus 0.258 in the glatiramer acetate group. So there was a relative risk reduction of 40.7% for fingolimod over glatiramer acetate. And importantly, no new safety signals emerged from that study. Natalizumab has been back on the market now since 2006. And of course, we're all aware of the concerns over the potential development of progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, or PML, mainly in patients with antibodies to JC virus on the Stratify assay. In a paper presented by Gudesblatt and colleagues at the CMSC meeting, a study looking at a post hoc analysis of natalizumab studies demonstrated that there was stability and sometimes improvement in baseline cognitive function as measured by a computerized neurocognitive test battery known as NeuroTrax. Infusion reactions and serious infusion reactions also were noted to decrease as more and more natalizumab doses occurred. One of the newer agents in use for the treatment of both relapsing remitting MS and primary progressive MS is ocrelizumab, an anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody that destroys B lymphocyte cells. The trial of ocrelizumab in primary progressive MS was known as the Oratorio study. And in this presentation by Giovannoni et al. At CMSC, a long-term reduction in brain atrophy was demonstrated over a 5-year period with ocrelizumab, and a marked increase in the percentage change in T2 lesion volumes occurred in placebo-treated patients in the double-blind period up to week 120. In both the two OPERA trials, which were the trials of ocrelizumab in relapsing remitting MS, which were highly positive, as well as the Oratorio trial in PPMS and the extensions of those trials, showed that the reported events per patient year in terms of both relapses and MRI activity, as well as safety experiences, continue to be consistent with those that were seen during the randomized portions of these trials. Clinical trial results are, of course, critically important in the licensing of a drug and telling us about the efficacy and safety of drugs. But clinical trials are conducted in very well-defined populations. So it's always important for us to understand how our drugs work once they are on the market, and their usage tends to be a little bit less restricted than that in the protocol-defined clinical trials. In this presentation at the CMSC, it's reassuring to find that the real-world data with the ocrelizumab showed similar efficacy to the pivotal trials, although patients with PPMS did seem to have a bit more disability progression than had been previously reported, probably reflecting the fact that we were seeing in the real world some treatment of patients with higher EDSSs and older age. It's worth remembering that the ocrelizumab trial in PPMS was conducted in patients with age 55 and younger, and with a relatively short duration of disease. I think a cautionary note is worth mentioning because as one moves into the real world and is tempted to treat patients who are older than 55 and with longer duration of disease, that one might be incurring a greater risk for infection and perhaps decreasing the benefit to risk ratio. In this real world study, however, the adverse events were comparable to those seen in the clinical trials, with infusion reactions being common and some infections. In the clinical trials, an increase in non-serious infections was found, but not in more serious infections. The authors of this abstract did not find any new or recurrent malignancies and suggested that using a standardized pre-infusion protocol may lower the rate of infusion reactions. The other very new drug to the market is Saponamod. Saponamod is a sphingosine-1 phosphate receptor modulator, as is the older drug fingolimod. Saponamod was studied in a population of secondary progressive MS, and the overall study result was positive. However, the FDA approved the drug for use in relapsing forms of MS, including secondary progressive MS with activity. That is, patients with secondary progressive MS who had recently experienced either relapses or new lesions on their MRI scan. The FDA did not recommend the drug for use in patients with secondary progressive MS without activity. That is, an individual who has been gradually declining but has not been showing new MRI lesions or relapses. A paper at the consortium meeting presented the design of a new study which has recently begun called the Exchange Study. And this is a study of Saponamod in people with relapsing forms of MS who are specifically converting from another therapy. So the results are still to come on the Exchange trial. Continuing this discussion of existing disease-modifying therapies and the theme of gathering more data once the drugs are in the real world, so to speak, was this presentation on the efficacy and safety of teriflunomide in relapsing remitting MS. And this study pooled the analysis from multiple studies with teriflunomide, including TEMSO, POWER, TOPIC, CANARY, as well as their extension studies, and a phase 4 TERI-PRO study. And what they found was that the annualized relapse rates were significantly lower among teriflunomide-treated patients compared to placebo patients across all age groups, and one continued to see sustained long-term efficacy in extension studies with EDSS scores remaining stable. In the real-world TERI-PRO and TAURUS MS1 studies, the results demonstrated that patients who switched from injectable therapies, either interferon beta or glatiramer acetate, to teriflunomide experienced increased treatment satisfaction, probably related to the better side effect profile of teriflunomide. Let's turn now to discuss a little bit about some emerging disease-modifying therapies. Let's begin with Ozanamod. Ozanamod is yet another sphingosine 1-phosphate receptor modulator. Both of these studies demonstrated considerable improvement over the comparator arm groups. But here at the CMSC, the authors of this paper, DeLuca et al., presented the fact that in the Sunbeam trial, the use of Ozanamod was associated with clinically meaningful improvements in cognitive processing speed as measured by the single-digit modality test compared to the interferon beta-1a comparator group. So two doses of Ozanamod were studied, 0.5 milligrams and 1 milligram, and both groups had comparable results on improvement in the SDMT. These sustained cognitive speed improvements were seen in 87.5% at 18 months and at 78.1% using the two different doses of Ozanamod. Interestingly, the cognitive speed improvement seemed to be greater in the group on the slightly lower dose of Ozanamod. Since 2013, dimethylfumarate has been on the market as a treatment for relapsing forms of MS. But one of the problems with dimethylfumarate has been sometimes prominent gastrointestinal symptoms, particularly at the initiation of therapy. A new agent that's been studied is diroximel fumarate, which is similarly converted to monomethyl fumarate, but appears to be better tolerated than dimethyl fumarate. And in this study, diroximel fumarate was associated with low rates of overall treatment discontinuation and discontinuation due to adverse events. The GI and flushing-related side effects were mild to moderate in severity and of short duration. In both newly diagnosed patients and those who had previously been treated with interferon and glatiramer acetate, the use of diroximel fumarate was associated with improvement in both clinical and radiological measures of disease activity for a median of about a year. So there were significant reductions in the annualized relapse rate, higher proportions of patients were relapse-free, and patients had significantly fewer GAD-enhanced lesions. Another agent currently under study is high-dose Biotin. biotin given in a dose of 100 milligrams 3 times a day. And this is a follow-up of an earlier study of the agent referred to as MD1003. And this study was looking at the role of biotin compared to placebo in a population that was a mixture of secondary progressive and primary progressive MS. In that original trial, the novel endpoint for a trial in progressive MS looked at confirmed disease improvement rather than a lessening of confirmed disease progression. So that was a high bar. The trial met its primary endpoint, even though only about 13% of patients improved, but none in the placebo arm improved. At the CMSC, results of a 48-month follow-up period with that agent were presented. 49% were still receiving treatment 4 years after the initiation of the trial. And the main reasons for withdrawal between month 12, the end of the double-blind period, and month 48 were perceived lack of efficacy, 21%, and consent withdrawal, 16%. Only a small percentage of patients discontinued because of adverse events. I think, in general, MD1003 was well tolerated. However, to me, this fairly high withdrawal rate because of perceived lack of efficacy, as well as the consent withdrawal, which may mean patients were not really convinced the drug was helping them, even though they didn't cite lack of efficacy as a reason, is a little cause for concern about whether this drug is ultimately going to prove to be an effective agent. There is a subsequent study of high-dose biotin that is currently ongoing and nearing completion. We're hopeful that the results of that study may be available as early as next spring, and then we'll find out whether this is going to be a useful agent to add to our armamentarium for people with progressive forms of MS. Another agent that has recently been under study in a phase 2 study in patients with relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis has been Evobrutinib, which is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor. This was a 48-week study that included 267 patients. Like most phase 2 trials, this primary endpoint here was an MRI endpoint looking at the reduction in total number of T1 GAD enhancing lesions at multiple time points. And in this study, a significant dose response phenomenon was observed, with higher doses being more effective. It was noteworthy in this study that a fairly high number of patients did develop some liver enzyme elevations. Grade 3 to 4 AST and ALT elevations occurred in 5.4% and 3.9% of patients, respectively, and the onset of these abnormalities was typically seen early. We talked earlier in this presentation about OkaloosaMap, the anti-CD20 agent. A couple of other anti-CD20 agents are under study at the moment, and one of them is Oobleck. And at the CMSC meeting, the results of a phase 2 open label extension with Oobleck were reported, and this demonstrated that the median B-cell depletion of more than 99% was observed at week 4 and at week 48. T1 GAD enhancing lesions decreased from a mean of 3.63 to 0. 93% of patients remained relapse-free, and the main side effect, not unexpectedly for this class of agents, was the presence of infusion-related reactions. This drug has one potential advantage over OkaloosaMap in that it has a much shorter infusion time. In this study, no discontinuations were reported as a result of severe adverse experiences. So we've covered quite a lot of ground regarding both current and emerging disease-modifying therapies in this segment. And a SMART goal for our listeners is for you to stay current on the latest clinical data on new and emerging therapies for MS, as well as to be able to evaluate the clinical significance of the clinical study results.